Hello students, in this lecture we're going to be talking about the synapse. Remember when I first started with the lecture on the neurons, I pointed out in this overview that we would have that neurons interact in chains, and that between each neuron there's a little space called the synapse, and it's in the synapse where the transmission of information is going to be chemical rather than electrical. And so we want to take a look at that now. So the synapse is a space between neurons, and there are literally trillions and trillions of synapses in your brain and throughout the spinal cord. And at these synapses, we're going to transmit information in a chemical manner, and we're going to transmit that information from one neuron to the next. Now, the neuron before the synapse is called the presynaptic neuron, and the neuron after the synapse is called the postsynaptic neuron. And again, remember, the synapse is the small space between the neurons. And so if we were to look at that, here they're actually showing here is one neuron right here. This would be the postsynaptic neuron, and here's its axon terminals. And notice the axon terminals, they're then going to impinge upon the cell body of the postsynaptic neuron. And there'll be a small space between the axon terminals of the presynaptic neuron and the cell body or the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. And this is actually a micrograph showing how the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron are interacting. The key the key molecule at that synapse is going to be a neurotransmitter. And what will happen is the presynaptic neuron will release the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter will cross the synaptic cleft. It will cross the small space between the pre- and postsynaptic neuron. And the neurotransmitter will then bind to a neurotransmitter receptor on the postsynaptic neuron. And when the neurotransmitter binds to the neurotransmitter receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, that will cause the EPSPs or IPSPs. And of course, if you'll remember from our discussion about EPSPs and IPSPs, if I have enough neurotransmitters crossing the synaptic cleft, binding to neurotransmitter receptors, if I get enough EPSPs created, the postsynaptic neuron will reach threshold and a new action potential will be created. So here we're going to take a look at all the events. There's going to be an action potential that's going to be traveling down the presynaptic neuron. Here's the presynaptic neuron. This is the postsynaptic neuron. When the action potential gets to the axon terminal, it will open voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium will enter. Calcium will cause the exocytosis of these synaptic vesicles that contain neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter will be released into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter will then bind to a neurotransmitter receptor, and that will then cause an EPSP or an IPSP. And then finally, the last step, after that has happened, the neurotransmitter will be then removed from that neurotransmitter receptor, and it will be degraded or will diffuse out of the synaptic cleft. And the neuron will then, once again, be able to respond to new neurotransmitters binding. Let's take a look at these steps one at a time. It starts in the presynaptic neuron. Again, this is the postsynaptic neuron. The action potential has traveled down the axon of the postsynaptic neuron. When it gets to the axon terminal, it's going to cause voltage-gated calcium channels to open, and calcium will then enter the axon terminal. As calcium enters the axon terminal, it will then cause these synaptic vesicles that contain neurotransmitter. It will cause those synaptic vesicles to move to the membrane surface of the axon terminal, and neurotransmitter will be released into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter will then diffuse across the synaptic cleft, and it will bind to the neurotransmitter receptor. When the neurotransmitter binds to the neurotransmitter receptor, so here is the neurotransmitter, here is the neurotransmitter receptor. When the neurotransmitter binds to the neurotransmitter receptor, it then causes graded potentials. It then causes the EPSPs or the IPSPs. And then after that, after the neurotransmitter is bound to its receptor and created the EPSPs, IPSPs, then the neurotransmitter is removed. It either diffuses out of the synapse or it is degraded. And at that point, the neurotransmitter receptor will be able to bind a new neurotransmitter and create a new EPSP. And so those are the events that occur at the synapse between neurons. Thank you.